Hi there everybody, this is David, and Final Fantasy IV, one of my favorite Final Fantasies of all time, is celebrating its 35th anniversary, and because of that, Square Enix came out with this interview going over the history of the game, its development, what was going on, and all that kind of stuff, and it's really fascinating, and I want to go over all of it with y'all, and that's totally worth the sub as you come and you join your party and you level on up with me. Thank you so much for your sub, your like, and your brand new hype. It helps me out a ton. So I'm finally back from Iceland. Finally made it back last night. Our plane was delayed, which was lovely. Then we missed our connection, which was even lovelier, but I finally made it home with an upper respiratory infection, because every single time that I travel, I get sick, because that's just fantastic. So, this is an interview, this is an interview between Tokita and Kitase, who were involved with Final Fantasy IV, as well as Final Fantasy X, and they were both working at Square Enix during the development of Final Fantasy IV, so they just kind of want to talk about it. They were going on and they were saying that Final Fantasy IV's development started after Final Fantasy III's development had ended, and that game was released in April of 1990, so basically the development started before April of 1990, and while Final Fantasy III was being developed, he was working on the Final Fantasy Legend, which is another one of my favorite games. That's actually a Saga game. It's the first game in the Saga series released on the Nintendo Game Boy. I played the bejesus out of that thing growing up. I loved it. Not as good as Final Fantasy II, or Final Fantasy Legend 2, I should say, but nothing's as good as Final Fantasy Legend 2. Not the DS version, the Game Boy version. Love the Game Boy version. So after Final Fantasy Legend was released, they joined the Final Fantasy III team to help with debugging and getting the development out and all that kind of stuff. So they say that development of Final Fantasy IV began in 1989, but the development period for that game was unusually long for the time, because when the project first came out, it was originally intended for the NES, the Nintendo Entertainment System, the first Nintendo, not the SNES, for those of you too young to remember. I remember this because it was my childhood. I didn't get an SNES till I was probably in 6th grade, so I had my entire elementary school years, all 6 years of that, just playing the NES, so that really did kind of mold me as a kid. And I do remember seeing an article way back when, it was in a magazine, talking about the early development of Final Fantasy IV and what it would be like, and it showed an NES game in like an airship shop. So it was, it was originally developed for the NES. But then it ended up being developed for the SNES due to some unexpected changes, which is interesting, because they were at this time, Square and Enix were separate. They were two rival companies, and Dragon Quest was going out. Dragon Quest released before Final Fantasy. Dragon Quest III and Final Fantasy I released pretty much right around the same time. So when you were playing Final Fantasy I, they were also playing Dragon Quest III. And then they went ahead and they released Dragon Quest IV, still for the NES. I'm kind of surprised that they delayed Final Fantasy IV to put it on the SNES instead of just keeping it on the NES to catch up with Dragon Quest, because they were releasing that on the NES. So then Kitase joins in and says, but whenever I first joined the project, it wasn't being released for the NES, it was already being made for the SNES. So at the time, there were a lot of flashy demos showcasing the SNES's Mode 7 feature. I remember there was even commercials. There was commercials about this, y'all, showing off the Mode 7 of the SNES and how cool it was and how the Sega Genesis didn't have it and only the SNES had it. And they were talking about how it lets you enlarge, shrink, and rotate the background. So when Sakaguchi saw it, he insisted that we take advantage of it. Kind of like that sight spell that you can cast. It goes up and it shows the entire world map, shrinking and enlarging the world map. And they say that's how the opening scene with the airship came together. And he was right there to see it happen. They wanted to use that Mode 7, and they wanted to show the shrinking and the enlarging in that opening scene. So he goes on to say the development period was around 1.5 years to around 2 years, because considering the time it was invested in the NES version, the game in its current form was developed in just 1 year on the SNES, but altogether roughly 2 years on the NES and the SNES right there. Then they go on to say that they wanted to challenge themselves with the SNES, but also the NES had a lot of limitations. And I remember doing this. I remember whenever I was a kid, I would try to design my own games and draw my own games and everything, and I knew that the NES only allowed 8 colors per sprite. So I would sit there and I would draw my little pixel guy in graph paper, and I would only use 8 colors for each guy because I was developing it for the NES. I know I'm old. Doing graph paper and colored pencils and all that kind of stuff, but that's just what you did. So they said that the SNES improved it, and they could use 16 colors, but that took up a lot of memory. So because of that, they still used 8 colors for most of the graphics, but even with that, it took up 2/3 of the entire memory capacity. But one of the graphic artists wanted to use all 16 colors, so he went straight to Mr. Sakaguchi to discuss it in person, and he was given permission to create the airship, the final dungeon, and Zeromus using 16 colors, but everything else had to only be in 8 colors. So yeah, really interesting right there. Then he goes on to say that if you weren't careful, the data could exceed the allocated space, and the system, whenever they were developing it, it didn't give any kind of error messages or warnings or anything, so it would overflow, nobody would know, and it would accidentally ruin other people's work. So that's why a lot of bugs came into play in a lot of these older games. If you remember playing Final Fantasy I for the NES, and they had all these swords, the Were Sword and the Rune Sword and things like that were supposed to be good against giant monsters or werewolf monsters or magical monsters or whatever, none of them worked. None of them worked. They didn't work as intended because of bugs and things like that. So they just go on, they say it was a really big struggle. There was also another scene, and you guys know this scene in Final Fantasy IV where Cecil protects Rydia as he fights at the end, but Rydia would jump into Cecil's bed, so people assumed that was intentional, but it wasn't intentional for, little 5-year-old Rydia to go jumping into Cecil's bed like that, so... They said they tried so many times to get it fixed and to get it to work, but they just couldn't get it to work properly right around them. Then they go on to talk about, around 1990, there was multiple teams developing games, and one of the games that they were involved in was Final Fantasy Adventure. That's the very first game on the Game Boy or it was the very first Mana game, and it was released for the Game Boy, Seiken Densetsu. So it was started off as a spin-off of Final Fantasy, because I believe in Japan it was even called Final Fantasy Seiken Densetsu. And there's a lot of Final Fantasy elements still in that game, such as the Chocobo, but then it really did become its own thing, a Secret of Mana, back on the SNES. He said that pretty much all the Game Boy games were consisted of new hires. Final Fantasy Legend, Final Fantasy Adventure. It was just a 6-man team of new hires, and they were right next to the Final Fantasy IV and the Final Fantasy Legend teams. And he would look over at the Final Fantasy IV team and think, wow, they're so elite, because at the time we were using black and white Macintoshes, but the Final Fantasy IV team got to use a color monitor, and woo! He remembers thinking how Final Fantasy titles are created using the latest tools right there. So yeah, it was just really, really, really fascinating, this entire interview. It's really freaking cool. They go on to talk about how they would have late night Dr. Mario tournaments, they'd be working to midnight, and rather than going home and resting like a normal person would, they were let's go play Dr. Mario all night long, and then just sleep in the office and then go back to work the next day. It's just really, really interesting. And then the final thing that they talk about, which I think is fascinating, it says, in the NES era, Dragon Quest was released before Final Fantasy, so it felt like we were constantly trying to catch up. But Final Fantasy was released for the SNES first. And while it came with its own pressures, it was also a chance to pull ahead, since both titles and series were tied with 4 titles each. So there was actually a discussion of going from Final Fantasy III to Final Fantasy V and skipping 4 altogether. The CEO himself of Square Soft said, yeah, we should just skip 4, go straight to 5 just to beat Dragon Quest. And thinking back on it now, kind of a brilliant idea, he says. So yeah, Just really, really, really fascinating stuff right here. I really loved this interview. I loved going over the history of Final Fantasy IV, and I think that things like this is just interesting to me, so I think it might be interesting to you, and I'd just like to share it with y'all. So thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think about this, and also what your memories with Final Fantasy IV are, because maybe they're similar to mine. I don't know. Let me know in the comments, and as always, have a good day.